for being here. I hope that you enjoy this program. As Paige said, we're just celebrating Black History, famous celebrities, artists, and just a few art pieces through different exhibits. So I hope you all enjoy and we get started. So this first exhibit that I'm on is actually celebrating Black history through the years. And so it has different time periods and where uh, like artists and famous Black celebrities, uh, they include their not only their culture, but how they celebrate in their own way of their Blackness. So I hope you enjoy this one. It's through the Google Arts. So I'll just be scrolling down as we listen to the music. And feel free to read. There's a little bit descriptions on each different uh, art and image.
We will also be linking these websites for you all to look after and show your family members or share with friends. So, yeah. Her shoes and she moved on down by the Jordan stream and then she shouted, Hallelujah! Done done my duty, got on my traveling shoes. Death came knocking on my
For hella black Lindy Hop.
sister Rachel, ready to go.
This is a hip hop performance, and there's a short video of them dancing.
Okay, let's give it up for Hella Black, Lindy Hop. Raise up, raise up, raise up. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, I need y'all to get up in the center right here. Come on, come on. Wow, wow, let's go. Hella Black, Lindy Hop.
Got on my traveling shoes, going everything knocking on my neighbor's door, saying, "Come on, neighbor, get you ready to go." And my neighbors to come down, buckle up his shoes, and he move on down by the Jordan Street, and then he shout, "Hallelujah, da 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 da." Got on my traveling shoes.
Now for the next exhibit, I'll be going towards standing up for change, African American women and civil rights movement. And with this exhibit, it has many of African American women during the civil rights movement and famous African American women, and just different trials and tribulations that they went through during the civil rights, and also you'll see like different initiatives that they and like resolutions that they put out, and just protesting and um, yeah, so you'll see like a bit of different pieces within this exhibit, and I'll go through them. So for this one's just going into civil rights and just African American and how they fought during the civil rights movement. And yes, and I just want to just because I know you all are reading the description, but how African American women were really very critical mass and within the civil rights movement, and how they wanted to change, even though in this time it was very challenging. And for this piece, this is the women's emancipation petition, and just this goes into like the women's suffrage, and um, as well as the abolition of like the women's suffrage movement. And this is Sonjia Truth. She was a former slave, and this piece actually just talks about her contribute her contribute her contribution in the civil rights and abolition. And so, real quick, I just want to read the bit of the description that they have, and it states that I have pounded and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? So just thinking about that, and just with I'd say the ancestors of just in my perspective, of my family and what they went through, it's very it kind of it, I have a perspective of how I would say where I am in this like now present, and how privileged I am. And I always want to make sure that I understand my own history, and not only that, but how I can make an impact in the future generation. But just knowing, I would say, of my past history within my family and understand my background is very pivotal for, I think, myself to, as a as a young Black woman. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that. But I'll move forward towards the next piece of Ida B. Wells Bennett. And this one kind of talks about, in the description of, um, in the 1892 of lynching and the enrage of locals who burned her piece and drove her from Memphis. And just read a little bit of it. It's very powerful, and just her challenges within like discrimination and sexism um, in her time. And this piece is with the Black Women's Club, and it's actually a movement that basically was in the 19th century, and how they organized and um, kind of um, just fought during the racial discrimination and sexism. And so, as you see, it has a little bit, talks about a little bit of the National Association of Colored Women's Club, and how it, their motto was lifting as we climb. So I feel like it's very important to lift each other up, um, but not only based off of your ethnicity or nationality or your color skin you are, or if you're um, just to remember to lift each other up and to support each other, and just basically be a nice human being, and to rise each other up, and just continue to advocate for others that sometimes their voice is getting I guess silenced. So, and with this piece, it was the founding president, Mary Church Towell, and it just talks a little bit about like the social reform and ending discrimination. And I really like this photograph of just how um, of just like the I guess the authenticity, sorry, of how she looks, and just the imagery of it.
Just to add to that, I like the quote: "The colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps to overcome, that of race as well as that of sex." Because, amen.
Yes, I definitely agree. Very powerful. And this is the first lady of the struggle, Mar- Mary McLeod Bethune. Uh, she was the first to achieve national prominence as the founder of Bethune Cookman College. And it kind of talks about into the political active National Council of Negro Women, as she was the Black Women Coalition of the organization. on based off of Indian segregation and discrimination. And this was like a photograph of the oh, and actually it was of Miss Bethune. It was in her last will and testament to African American community, faith, and dignity, harmony, and the challenge of developing confidence in one another. And this is the National Football Committee and the women and men. They joined up together a abhorrence at the growing of violence against African American. Formed the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and it was in the 1909. And for this one, it was during the civil rights. And this one kind of talks about how African American women organized and led grassroots efforts during the civil rights era. And they formed different image of new Black women leaders. And so I believe this one was educated club women and other grassroots organizers. So. And this one was sorry, I was reading like those small description right here, but it's also um part of the I believe it was Rosa Parks, how she had the title of Mother of Civil Rights Movement, and um and just talking about how she refused to give up her seat in the science section for Blacks in the bus to a white man. And this one talks a little bit more about Rosa Parks and how her protest sparked the modern movement. Um, and it kind of just goes a little bit into um, um, based kind of like on how her decision really um, impacted, but also um, encouraged more people to protest and boycott. And the buses, the Montgomery bus system. And this one also goes into the Women's Political Council and an organization of Black women active in anti-segregation activities and politics. And it kind of just talks about um, how the Women Political Council president, Joanne Robertson, seized the opportunity to protest about systematic discrimination. And this one was, um, I believe, again, a protest. This one kind of talks about how um, other like protests and acts of civil disobedience, and just during the Montgomery bus boycott, and how it really led a national movement by Black, white men, women, children, to demand the end of de jure segregation.
And that photo was taken in 1960. If you guys see at the bottom left corner, you could see the dates on them and like where they were taken by who. So we did include the links in the chat. So if you guys click, you can click the artist, you can click all that fun stuff.
Yes. And this was also, I believe this one talks about how the Black woman became involved in all aspects of protests during the 1950s and the 60s. Um, this as well, many rose to national importance, none achieved the prominence of the male leadership team. And this picture was taken during 1960. And this one is talks a little bit about the president of the NAACP. Um, talks about the Arkansas chapter and how the co-owner of Arkansas' largest Black newspaper, DC Bates, played a crucial role in school desegregation, and especially the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision decreased school segregation unconstitutional, but yet ruling was unenforced. I just want to touch a little bit into the Little Rock Nine and how successful integrated the school under the protection of the federal troops, and how brave those students were. Um, definitely, definitely, like I always think like if I ever traveled back in time, like I would have just loved to just witness and just be a part of that, and just how encouraged they were, even though it was very intense, but they still had the courage um, to just um, stick up with what they believed in, and that they do um, earn like their own to still have a right to have their own education. So, and I believe this one will be the last photo, but this one talks about just Ruby Hurley was one of the front lines of the modern civil rights movement as the NAACP executive. And just touching a little bit into that she organized youth councils um, and college chapters, building a base of 25,000 youth members, especially the NAACP Youth Council members launched in the 1960s sit-in movement. and definitely proving the value of the foundation Hurley laid down. And so while you all are finishing reading the description of Ruby Hurley, the next exhibit will go into Martin Luther King Jr. And um, yeah, and again, it just talks about um, Martin Luther King Jr. Uh, his movement of really um, gathering all civil rights activists, people, women, men, white, all ethnicities, and just trying to, as it says, just marching forward. So we'll go into the civil rights movement, um, and again, this one is, I believe, a Google Arts and exhibit. So it will be um, in the chat as well. And as you see here, you see Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Carletta Scott, and it is a brief information about both of them. And this one is a video of Martin Luther King Jr. and his story and testaments. So let me play it real quick.
Dr. King was born in Atlanta on January 15th, 1929, down on Auburn Avenue. And Dr. King grew up in a household with his parents, Martin Luther King Sr. and his mother, but also his grandparents, the Reverend A.D. Williams and his wife. Now, the Reverend Williams had become the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue. And that becomes the family church. So it's the church in which Marty King grows up and is raised. Now, Dr. King himself is educated in the public schools of Atlanta. He goes off to Booker T. Washington High School here in Atlanta before getting to matriculate at Morehouse College, which is where his father had gone to school. After Morehouse College, Marty King decides to go off to seminary, and he attends Crozier Theological Seminary up in Pennsylvania. After Crozier, he goes to Boston University. In Boston, he meets a very attractive young woman. Her name is Coretta Scott. They get married, and they debate what to do. Coretta Scott King was not interested in returning to the South. Martin King was. So he interviews at several churches and is tendered an offer at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. They have a child, and then the bus boycott occurs.
Eventually, segregation in public transportation will pass away. And I think we should start now preparing for the inevitable.
King is recruited to be the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. He takes on that responsibility after much prayer and thought. Now, in Montgomery, the effort to organize for the protest results in success with the bus boycott's conclusion in 1956, but also the desire to keep the protest going. So in 1957, the pastors involved in the Montgomery Improvement Association By this point, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. These figures, joined by others, will organize what's called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The SCLC will be organized with the purpose of taking this protest regionally and leading civil rights reform in America. In February of 1960, Martin Luther King and his family moved to Atlanta. King accepted the co-pastorate of Ebenezer Baptist Church under his father, and the family moved into a house on Boulevard. Now, King would then go on from his position at Ebenezer Baptist Church to lead the civil rights movement. In August of 1963, civil rights leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. A. Philip Randolph had proposed what was called a March on Washington for Jobs. And the point was for Black people to come to Washington and insist that they be given equal access for employment. Thousands came, and it was a peaceful demonstration, occupying the nation's capital for a day to listen to speeches being delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall. And among those speaking were Fred Shuttlesworth, John Lewis, who was the chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But the person who stole the limelight, of course, was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose I Have a Dream speech captured better than anyone ever had before the goals and aspirations, not just of Black people, but of everybody.
Freedom and justice, I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Do you have any business in the courthouse?
The only business we had was to come by to the board of registers to register.
The board of registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you were informed. You came down to make a mockery out of this courthouse, and we're not going to have it.
After the Civil Rights Act and the March on Washington, attention turned to the voting rights and the denial by white governments to register Black voters. But the climax occurs in Selma, Alabama, where in the middle of Alabama's Black Belt in the old plantation district, Black people had been denied access to the ballot. And Dr. King and SCLC will support the demonstrations there. So coming in to work with SNCC in Dallas County, Alabama, SCLC will organize protests around the county government that was refusing to register Black voters. This culminates in what's called the Selma campaign of March of 1965. And Dr. King is not there on Bloody Sunday when John Lewis and Hosea Williams lead a march out of Brown's Chapel AME Church across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and are beaten by Alabama state troopers. All of it captured on film, all of it broadcast around the nation and the world, all of it leading to Selma to Montgomery march that Dr. King did lead. And indeed, President Johnson did propose and the Congress did pass that voting rights legislation. King comes back to Atlanta, meets with his advisors in SCLC, and he says, we've got to organize the poor of our country and promote human rights. And he sets forth an agenda for what's called the Poor People's Campaign. King came back to the notion of occupying the nation's capital, encouraging the poor people from across America to come to Washington, D.C., and to remain there until the system opened up and addressed their needs and their concerns. This wasn't for Black people only. This was for white people, for Native Americans, for Asians, for everybody. And he encouraged them all to come. So it fit when in Memphis, Tennessee, Black men who were working as garbage men, cleaning the streets, when they went on strike to demand a living wage. Now,
Memphis, Tennessee, and next to the Mississippi Delta, the big plantation area, the agricultural South was full of poor people who were unemployed and needing work. And so in Memphis, the city leaders didn't pay workers very much money because there was always somebody out there who would do the job for less. And those garbage men went on strike, and their motto was, "I am a man." And they stood up to say, "We deserve a living wage." They asked King to come support them. How could he not? Living wages for working people? It fit the objectives of the Poor People Campaign. And so he goes. And it's there in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, an assassin shoots him down on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, bringing to an end his life, but not his legacy. That Poor People's Campaign was held in Washington, D.C. The Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy assumed the presidency of the SCLC, and within weeks of Dr. King's murder, his widow, Coretta Scott King, would begin promoting the idea of a Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, which might forever teach the values of that Kingian nonviolence that he promoted. So his legacy continues. It continues in the King holiday we have every January. It continues in the drive for human rights and the building of civil rights memorials at all of these venues where the demonstrations took place. And so that legacy is still with us today. A legacy of advocating for equality, for economic justice, for international peace, and for human rights.
So this piece just kind of touches in again as the video did state of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King's the movement during Albany and just how they strategized of the inability to force conversation. And this one it states that how almost last, but certainly not least. And as you see, it does state for jobs and freedom. Also, it mentions John Lewis, rest in peace, Mr. Medgar Evers, and Philip Rodolph, and a few celebrities and artists like Paul Newman, Harry Belafonte, Jackie Robinson, Sammy Davis Jr., and how they gathered together 20,000 or 100,000 attendees to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And this is again a photo of the slick and just affiliated with the Savannah Freedom Now movement.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later,
Oh, my bad.
the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment, This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
And I just want to stop right there. It's a really powerful speech, as we all know. And as well, I just wanted to just talk a little bit about how Martin talks about the undeniable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for all men. Um, and yeah, I just wanted to touch on that as well. And um, the next photo shows Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, um, and they're as they meet each other in the 1964. And it's a little bit interesting on, I would say, the approach of Martin Luther King has more of a peace and nonviolent approach of towards the injustice and trying to um, combat all the systematic um, uh, barriers um, within um, the U.S. and how Martin X has more of, as I say, is like a more militant approach to kind of be a little bit more forceful as uh, they have a movement and protest for our rights. And here's actually another video. This video, I believe, it's 3 minutes. So I'll play this one, and then we'll move into the next the closing remarks.
By the time we get to the March in Washington, August 1963, you have 250,000 persons who were there in the march. You had a platform where you had ministers, you had many coalitions speaking, talking about the importance of civil rights and how we needed to pass legislation. We knew that President Kennedy initially was involved in that as part of him becoming president. But by the time of the march, people were feeling antsy. It hadn't happened. After the march, we were ready.
But really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Congress felt they needed to do something about this in order to ensure that we wouldn't have discrimination on the basis of gender, race, color, or national origin. Those are the words that are in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We have a federal agency that's now involved in making sure that those rights are reinforced, and it led to other pieces of legislation that expanded it to persons with disabilities, older persons, just as part of expanding the rights that American citizens have. Once we moved from the March on Washington, that actually served as a movement, because when you think about it, Congress started to act. We had the Civil Rights Act, and then you may remember all the protests that were occurring about getting people to register to vote, and folk were hurt in that process. Congress felt the need to put in another piece of legislation that protected our right to vote. And it wasn't just that we had a right to vote, it was to take out those kind of things that we used to stop people from going to the polling polls by saying, well, can you read or can you write, or moving place you can vote.
And one of the things to think about it is that this issue, the Voting Rights Act, is something that we talk about today. It's not just something that happened in 1965. It's a piece of discussion because it's a protected right. Every time you go to vote for somebody in an election is because in 1965, we made it so that all of us can vote without having someone hurt us, without violence that occurred before the 1965 Act.
And I just wanted to say, I felt how powerful and I don't word, but how I guess definitely pivotal because during our time, how there was many African American men and women did vote in the presidential election, and so just seeing how back then and where we are now, it's definitely very important just having that right to vote. And just as the closing for today's art walk through history, and I just want to leave you all with this final video. Um, it was it's actually in the California African American Museum. It's a really amazing museum. When hopefully when uh, places more museums open up, you are able to check out this museum. It has wonderful exhibits. I definitely encourage. I'm gonna play this one.
I have one painting in the sanctuary exhibition that consists of a singular portrait of a natural hair vlogger on YouTube. And it is constructed out of colored epoxy resin. And the face is decoupaged with imagery from natural hair brands that she represents. When I was in grad school, I went through the process of going natural. So I started doing research, fell down the YouTube natural hair movement rabbit hole. YouTube and social media was where I could go to see other Black women around the world showing me how to do my hair and how to react to my hair. It was a space for us, by us, and I don't know who I would be or what I would look like without it.
And yes, so that was as closing and just thinking about embracing, especially for me as African American woman, just embracing my hair and just learning more about it. It's really important and pivotal of just learning more about yourself. And so that was as closing. Thank you all for coming and just learning a little bit more about history and just being here with us today. I greatly appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. And yes, thank you so much for everyone joining us today. Hope you all have an amazing day and a wonderful weekend.